3,000 years. Think about that for a second. Today in this explainer, we're diving into one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. And the sheer scale of Chinese history is, well, it's honestly staggering. We're talking about an enduring civilization spanning over 3 millennia of recorded history. I mean, it's older than the Roman Empire, yet it's literally still driving global headlines today. Across all those centuries, massive kingdoms have risen and collapsed, huge armies have crossed deserts, and entire eras have just vanished into the past. But here's the wild part. Through all of that time, through all of that turbulence, something remarkable stuck around. A profound cultural identity and this enduring idea of a unified China.
So you might be wondering, how does a civilization survive 3,000 years of constant cyclical collapse? Because look, China's history isn't just one smooth, uninterrupted upward line of progress. Not at all. It's more like a violent pendulum swing. It swings back and forth between these soaring, incredibly prosperous golden ages and catastrophic, devastating wars. Emperors built enormous states, and then rebels tore them right back down.
And right at the very center of that pendulum swing is one absolutely crucial concept, the dynasty. You can kind of think of it like a corporate monopoly over a nation. A dynasty was the core engine driving this massive history, a ruling family or political house that controlled China. But the key takeaway here, the rule was never ever guaranteed forever. When a dynasty became weak or corrupt or fractured, the door was blown wide open for another power to just overthrow it and claim the right to rule. So the fall of one powerful empire meant the inevitable and often incredibly bloody rise of another. Okay, to make sense of this epic timeline without getting totally lost, we're going to decode this history into 6 logical chapters. The cycle of dynasties, forging the first empire, golden ages and invaders, the final imperial eras, the fall of emperors, and finally rebuilding modern China. Let's get into it.
Starting right off with Chapter 1, the cycle of dynasties, foundations and philosophies.
So long before the great imperial empires, the foundations of Chinese civilization were laid along the Yellow River, eventually growing into these complex political kingdoms. The earliest historically documented one is the Shang Dynasty, which dates all the way back to the 2nd millennium BCE. And the Shang were incredible innovators. They developed sophisticated bronze technology and an early form of Chinese writing, using what are called oracle bones to communicate with ancestors and predict the future. But eventually, the Shang fell to a neighboring power called the Zhou, and the Zhou introduced this brilliantly dangerous concept to justify their takeover. They called it the Mandate of Heaven. It was essentially history's ultimate cosmic performance review. The idea was that heaven itself granted a ruler the right to govern. But, and this is a massive but, that right was strictly conditional. If a ruler became corrupt or incompetent, heaven would just withdraw its support, and usually signal that through natural disasters, famine, or political chaos. So it gave rulers divine legitimacy, sure, but at the exact same time, it perfectly justified armed rebellion against them. And that single concept gave birth to a defining, almost algorithmic historical pattern. Keep these 5 steps in the back of your mind as we travel through the centuries today. First, a dynasty rises and establishes order. Next, it enters a period of prosperity. But then, inevitably, a crisis hits. That crisis sparks a rebellion because the people believe the mandate of heaven has been lost. And finally, the old dynasty is overthrown. Replacement occurs, and the whole cycle just resets.
Now, as the Zhou dynasty eventually weakened, China shattered into all these competing, warring factions. But the violent fragmentation of this warring states period ironically sparked an absolute intellectual golden age. 3 massive philosophies emerged to answer one fundamental question: how should society actually be governed? You had Confucianism, which focused heavily on morality, education, and tradition. You had Taoism, which urged harmony with the natural order. And then you had legalism, which argued that only a strong government with incredibly strict laws and severe punishments could actually maintain order. And these aren't just dusty ancient ideas, by the way. The echoes of Confucianism tradition and legalist control absolutely still influence Chinese society today.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Forging the First Empire, Unity and Control.
Out of the chaos of those warring states, one kingdom adopted that super strict legalist philosophy we just talked about and used it to ruthlessly conquer all its rivals. That state was Qin. In 221 BCE, its ruler unified the Chinese states for the very first time, declaring himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. He built roads, he standardized writing, and he began these massive defensive projects up in the north. But 15.
Yep, that is exactly how many years the Qin dynasty actually lasted. The Qin state was incredibly powerful, heavily centralized, and just extraordinarily harsh. Millions of people were forced into labor, and punishments were brutal. Because of this massive human cost, Qin Shi Huang's dynasty collapsed into rebellion almost immediately after his death. Yet, despite lasting only 15 years, it literally created the centralized blueprint for 2,000 years of future empires, and even gave the name China to the world. From the ashes of the Qin's super short run, the pendulum swung right back up. The Han Dynasty rose in 202 BCE, cementing Confucianism into government and opening up the famous Silk Road to the west. The Han period was so culturally foundational that even today, China's largest ethnic group is still known as the Han. But, true to the cycle, the Han eventually collapsed in 220 CE, leading to the legendary Age of Division, most famously known as the Three Kingdoms period. After centuries of division, China was finally reunited in 581 CE by the Sui dynasty, who ended up building the massive Grand Canal, though, once again, at a terrible human cost.
And that leads us to Chapter 3, Golden Ages and Invaders, Splendor and Conquest. This era kicked off with the Tang Dynasty, a cosmopolitan golden age of immense wealth, Buddhism, and honestly some of the greatest poetry ever written. That is, until devastating military rebellions permanently crippled the once mighty empire. Following the Tang, we get the Song Dynasty. Now, militarily, they really struggled against their northern rivals, but economically, they were an absolute powerhouse. In fact, they were using widespread paper money centuries before Europe even figured out the concept. The Song oversaw what historians call an early commercial revolution. We're talking rapid urbanization, massive agricultural booms, dramatic population growth, and the development of world-changing technologies like gunpowder and the magnetic compass. It was a time of absolute marvels.
However, all that economic prosperity just couldn't stop the threat that was looming from the north. In the 13th century, Kublai Khan's Mongol Empire swept in, completely conquering China and establishing the Yuan Dynasty. So for the first time ever, China was ruled entirely by a dynasty of outsiders. The Yuan connected China to the vast Eurasian trade network. This is the era of Marco Polo's travels, by the way. But eventually, a whole series of devastating floods, famines, and the massive rebellions that followed forced the Mongols out.
And so we enter Chapter 4, the final imperial eras, the Ming and Qing. With the Mongols out of the picture, native rule was restored in 1368 under the Ming Dynasty, and the Ming wanted to project absolute, undeniable power. They built the sprawling Forbidden City in Beijing, they significantly expanded the Great Wall, and they launched Admiral Zheng He on these massive, awe-inspiring naval expeditions all the way to the East African coast. They were seriously powerful. But eventually, internal corruption and economic strife weakened them, inviting yet another invasion. In 1644, a group from the northeast called the Manchus crossed the wall, seized Beijing, and established the Qing dynasty. Once again, outsiders were in control. But ironically enough, the Qing ended up building one of the most expansive and powerful empires in all of Chinese history. They expanded the borders dramatically, oversaw huge population and agricultural growth, and China became one of the world's largest economies. But beneath the surface, land scarcity, overpopulation, and severe corruption were setting a really dangerous stage.
Which takes us to Chapter 5, The Fall of Emperors, the Century of Crisis. So the Qing dynasty was already facing immense internal pressures, but then they encountered a terrifying, completely unprecedented external threat: industrial Europe. Britain really wanted access to Chinese markets, but China didn't really want British goods. So Britain essentially used opium to force the issue. And it is honestly staggering how rapidly 2,000 years of imperial authority just unraveled. First, Britain's industrial navy completely crushed China in the Opium Wars, shattering the illusion of Qing invincibility and forcing these super humiliating treaties. That glaring weakness sparked the Taiping Rebellion, which was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, costing millions of lives. Then came a shocking 1894 defeat to a rapidly modernized Japan. Anti-foreign sentiment completely exploded in the Boxer Uprising, and finally the entire system reached its breaking point with the 1911 revolution.
And right here is the definitive turning point. In 1912, the final Qing emperor, Puyi, abdicated. Just think about that for a second. Over 2,000 years of continuous dynastic rule, a system dating all the way back to that first emperor of Qin we talked about, just ended. But getting rid of the emperors didn't instantly fix things. Far from it. It plunged China into a chaotic new era of competing warlords, a bitter split between the nationalists and the newly formed communists, and eventually a devastating, brutal war with Japan during World War II.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Chapter 6, Rebuilding Modern China, Republic to Global Power.
After Japan surrendered in 1945, the civil war between the Chinese nationalists and communists resumed in full force. By 1949, the communists emerged victorious, and Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, sending the nation hurtling into a completely new, radical era of state control. Now, to understand the massive shifts of the late 20th century, we really have to contrast China's two most influential modern leaders impartially, based on the source material. Under Mao Zedong, the government attempted incredibly rapid transformations through massive state campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. According to historical records, these policies resulted in immense societal chaos and a catastrophic loss of life. But following Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping took over. And while maintaining strict one-party political control, Deng radically pivoted the economy. He introduced market-oriented reforms, allowed private enterprise, and triggered an era of rapid, explosive industrial growth.
And the breathtaking speed of that modern integration is undeniable. Starting from Deng's reforms in 1978, China moved rapidly onto the world stage. Hong Kong and Macau returned to Chinese sovereignty in the late 90s, and in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. By leveraging its unique combination of a largely market-oriented economy operating securely under a one-party political system, China transformed from an agriculturally focused, war-torn nation into literally one of the most vital engines of the entire global economy.
But as we look at modern China today, with its massive, sprawling cities and sheer global influence, listen to this rhythm again. Unity, division, rebellion, reunification, prosperity, crisis. It perfectly echoes the relentless rhythm we've been tracking all the way since the Qing Dynasty. The politics might have modernized, the technology has certainly changed, but the fundamental historical pattern of collapse and renewal has been echoing across this exact same landscape for thousands of years. I really want to highlight this final, powerful realization from our source material. Dynasties vanished, but the idea of China endured. The emperors, the warlords, the outside invaders, they are all temporary. But the civilization itself, the written language, the deep cultural identity, the resilience of the people, that is permanent. A civilization is much, much more resilient than any of the rulers who claim to possess it. Which leaves us with this final question. After 3,000 years of this incredible cycle of collapse and renewal, what will the next chapter of China's story actually look like? The next time you see global headlines about China today, don't just see the events of this week or even this year. Look a little closer, and you might just see the latest page being written in a continuous 3,000-year-old script. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.